Hi everyone, I'm Jacquiline Melilli, writer and editor at Vision Christian Media. No doubt you've heard that For King and Country will be touring Australia in May for their homecoming tour. They'll be promoting their fourth studio album, What Are We Waiting For?, and including previews from their new film, Unsung Hero, to be released in Australia on the 30th of May. Unsung Hero is an inspiring true story of the Smallbone family's faithful and courageous journey to America after David Smallbone's Christian concert promotion business collapsed in Australia. David and Helen Smallbone, with their 6 children and another one along the way, arrived in America with all their belongings in suitcases and the last of their savings. They slept on the floor of their home, mowed lawns and raked leaves to make ends meet. The first few years were pretty tough. But today, 3 of their 7 children, Rebecca St. James and Luke and Joel Smallbone, have won Grammy Awards and worked alongside music royalty, including Dolly Parton. But there's another reason why Unsung Hero is special to us at Vision Christian Media. I managed to pin down our CEO, Phil Edwards, to share his connection with David Smallbone. Hi, Phil. Thanks for taking the time to have a chat.
Oh, I'd love to chat.
One of the best parts of my job is to write about people's stories. I love hearing people's stories, and I happen to hear your story, which I was very intrigued about how you first started in the Christian music industry. You also celebrated your 20th year at Vision this February, so congratulations on that. That's a very big milestone. But it would be great if you could share with us how you started in Christian music industry.
Well, I'm sure you can relate to how quickly time flies.
Yes.
20 years have gone past, like, wow, where did that go? And then if I think back even longer than that, and back to what you're talking about, so I left school in 1986, which is the dark ages as far as my children are concerned, back in the day. But didn't really know what I wanted to do when I left school. I always had an interest in media and music. Play a little bit of music, always loved listening to music, and found myself working in the Christian music industry through radio, and it was through David Smallbone, who's the father, and his wife Helen, father and mother of Rebecca St. James and the Smallbone boys, who are For King and Country. And it was really exciting for a young fellow. I was, 18, 19, and thrust into this creative scene.
And you were later promoted to tour manager for some pretty big names. You had Striper and you had Amy Grant. So tell us a little bit more about that.
I worked for Smallbones for 4 years, I think it was, from about 1988 to 92. And we did, most of the Christian music artists that were touring through. There were a few groups that were doing them, and we did quite a few of the big names that came through, and a lot of smaller ones as well that people didn't know. But yes, there were some there, like the Amy Grants, and Whiteheart was another interesting one. David Meese, Don Francisco, Sheila Walsh, and a whole lot of others at the time as well, some of whom were a little controversial. Mike Warnke was a comedian who was later shown to not quite have been telling the truth with some of his stories. But it was, really interesting times, and to get to actually go and hang around with these people and go on tour with them, not on stage, but just making sure everything ran smoothly was good. It was fun times.
Do you have any special stories of anything that happened?
Well, what goes on tour stays on tour.
Oh, okay.
But I was just reminded recently about Don Francisco. I was listening to Vision Radio, and we actually played one of his songs. And it just took me right back there. And I remember we were driving in the car. It was Don, myself, Steve Apirana, who's a New Zealand singer-songwriter, and a keyboard player that Don had brought with him, a guy named Randy, somebody. And we were just joking around and carrying on. And Don's a fairly intense kind of a guy. And I just remember he quite tersely told us all to be quiet. And, when the artist tells you that, you kind of listen. So... But there were some interesting times.
So you're a bit rowdy then, Phil.
Oh, sometimes. Yeah.
And I heard something about your bus driving with Striper. Were you driving them around?
Well, I wasn't supposed to be. It was a show. This must have been about 1990 maybe, we did a tour around Australia, and there was a show at the State Sports Centre in Sydney, and they'd just done sound check, and I remember being kind of at awe at the drummer's drum kit that had like 4 kick drums. There were like 4 drum kits all combined together, and as an aside, they needed to get back to the hotel, and there was nobody to drive them, and the only vehicle that we had to take them was like a Toyota Coaster 18-seat bus, which I didn't have a license for. But I knew how to drive. I'd driven trucks and all sorts of things on the farm, so I thought, okay, I hope I don't get caught. Yes, It was interesting. We got there.
That's good. Good to see that side of it too. So another thing I wanted to ask you is about, it's such a tough industry. I'm not sure what it was like back then. I know it's a bit tougher now. How did, how was the Australian Christian industry back in the 80s and the early 90s when you were in there compared to now?
Well, the music business, I think, is a tough gig. Doesn't matter what you're doing. And there's a lot of passionate people that are trying. It's probably a bit like writing, novelists and those kinds of things. There's a lot of people are trying, then there are a few who succeed and can actually make a living out of it. It's certainly the case in something like Christian music. And it was a different scene then. There was a lot more going on. It really changed quite substantially in the 90s. The kind of the bottom fell out of it being sustainable as far as tours and things go. But there was quite a bit of activity going, but a little bit like farming. From a touring point of view, you probably lose money on 2 or 3, and then you might make enough to recoup your losses on the next one. So it was tough going.
So Phil, the Unsung Hero movie, you've had a preview of it already. It was uncut at the time. But I heard that it was quite an emotional experience for you to watch that, because you were there at that time, at that first beginning part of the movie.
It's kind of surreal, actually, watching a movie, knowing this is a story that I was part of at the time, because having worked for them when all of this was happening. But it was a bit emotional because the context was it was a meeting of Christian media people, and it was a preview of the then early cut of the movie. This was last year. And wasn't David, was someone in the room come and tap me on the shoulder and said, at the very last minute, could you come up and say a few words just after the movie had finished? And I was still sort of processing everything that we'd just seen. So it was pretty emotional.
Which part particularly did really strike a chord?
Look, I think just
without spoilers, but
well, no, I won't give away any spoilers in the movie. But I just think they quite faithfully represented the struggle, and it actually gave me a little bit of an insight into what they went through, because I wasn't there with them in America going through it, but I knew them, and I knew that they were going through things. But when you get that understanding that maybe somebody has been hurt or they've gone through something, and then you get a little bit of extra insight into what they actually experienced at the time. And I guess that's the bit that hit me. And I'm a bit older now too. I mean, this was 30 years ago. So I'm putting myself in David's shoes much more now than I possibly could have, when I was in my early 20s. And understanding, wow, this must have been really, really difficult for them. So that's the bit that really
Because you were
me.
there right in there. They had a huge property, is that right? And they worked from that property. So you were there, you saw the family all working together.
Yep.
So you were very, very big part.
Oh, yeah, we were right there. They had an office in their home, which was on some acreage in the sort of northern part of Sydney. And the kids were always coming in and out of the office, and I remember Luke and Joel when they were like this and running in and out doing different things.
And Joel directed the movie, and he also played David in the movie.
Yes,
which is really cool because he looks like his dad, doesn't he?
He does look like his dad. And the thing, even you'll note in the movie when you see it that David character is wearing this leather jacket. Very early 90s looking kind of leather jacket. And David used to wear that thing everywhere. So, it's no surprise that they have that featured prominently in the movie. But I was actually, the only criticism I suppose I have of the movie is I think it actually did display David a bit angrier than certainly I remember him. I don't remember him as an angry man at all. Perhaps that's a bit of creative license. But other than that, it is a very faithful retelling. I think they've captured all of the characters, the kids, because they have a big family, right? They got 7 children.
7 children.
So they've captured them all quite well. They all have very unique personalities, but they're a wonderful family. And I think one of the reasons why they've succeeded in ministry is because of that family together thing. I think there's a good lesson there for all of us with families that we need to pull together more.
And then with David's company collapsing, there was that difficulty of walking in faith, and then something like this happens, which was quite devastating for them. And then they did that big leap to America, leap of faith, really. And then we talk a lot. We live by faith every day, don't we? So what was at that period when that was all happening? And then obviously you had to sort of have a change in career. What happened as far as your next move? And with David, how can you give us a bit of an idea of how all that was there? Because you were there at that time. So,
well, this is all the subject of the movie Unsung Hero. What happened to them at that time? And it was a tour that we did with Amy Grant around Australia, and it was a big tour by our standards. Small by the standards of the other big artists of the day, the Billy Joels and so on. But it was a big tour, the Sydney Entertainment Centre, the Tennis Centre in Melbourne, the Brisbane Entertainment Centre, and others around the country. Big touring entourage, a band, full band and production people and everything else. I think there was 20-something people in the touring entourage, big costs. Unfortunately, it just bombed. And as I reflect on it, there were a few things that converged. If you remember, there was the recession that we had to have, according to our then Prime Minister. And I think things were tight for people. The ticket prices were more than what people were used to paying. And at the time, I think it was when Amy Grant was crossing over from being, a really, obvious, overt Christian artist to being more in the mainstream. And she'd had an album that came out that had some hits on it, good songs. Baby Baby went, I think, number 1 or 2 in Australia at the time. But it wasn't really enough to pull a new crowd. And so perhaps there were some people that didn't turn up because, they didn't like the direction she was going. So the sum of all of that was that David's business couldn't sustain the loss. It was hundreds of thousands of dollars that were lost. And it was very, very tough for them. I guess I was to some extent in the middle of it, but the worst thing that happened for me was I was out of a job. For them, it was harrowing, very difficult. And I know David took it very hard. He felt a failure to his family, a failure potentially as a man, perhaps a failure before God. You'd have to ask him about those things, but I know it hit him really hard. And when they went to America on the promise of, another job that fell through, when they got there with very little money in their pocket, and they knew some people, so I guess that helped. It really forced them into that faith space. And I love that, the movie, I've had the opportunity to see the movie, and I recommend it heartily. It's pretty faithful to the story, I think. They've captured the characters and the story really well. But it is an inspirational story of faith. And, I often think about things like this as being a bit like, you can see a train going past, or perhaps you can see a parade, and you only get to see the bit of the train or the parade from where you're standing. But God sees the whole thing. He's got the helicopter view up here and can see the train from start to finish. He can see where the track is going, where it's come from. And I think the challenge for us is, we're in the middle of that, a tough time, a dark tunnel perhaps, and we can't see where the future is. Faith is the bit that actually says, God, I trust you in this. I know you can see the destination, even though I can't right now. And I think that was their journey. And one thing led to another for them. They knuckled down, they worked hard, they pulled together as a family, and that's very much what the movie's about. Their family, and Helen in particular, she's an amazing lady. She's just an inspiration. And the movie itself is a great title, Unsung Hero. It really wraps up Helen, I think.
Yes, I read Helen's book and I found it really very insightful, but she's so honest about how difficult it was. Just the whole, not just the whole journey, but even once they got a breakthrough, the touring, everything they did, everything together as a family. She homeschooled them from the tour buses. It was incredible, like their faith of just. I found it really inspiring. So I can't wait to see the movie because I think it's. I've had everyone that's seen it, the previews that you saw raved about it and said it was fantastic. So I just think it inspire people with their faith just to know that even though disasters happen, God, if you persist and just hold on tight, just brings you through. And I can't wait to see it.
Well, you'll enjoy it when you do.
Yeah, thanks. Is there anything else that from the movie that you'd like to share? Any particular scenes that you thought were just...
Don't want to give anything away. Only to say that there's highs and lows of emotion in the film. There's times where you'll laugh. There's times where you'll cry and really empathise with them. And overall, it's a great production.
That's great. And you've kept a friendship with David?
Yes, I have.
That's really
We
good.
keep in contact now and again through email, and it's been great to be able to see them. And I've actually been to their house in the US and different things. So they're good friends.
Were they the only Christian concert promoters at the time? Like once they went, what happened to Christian music after that?
There were a couple of others. There were probably two main groups that were doing Christian touring at the time. Another gentleman named Alan Kennedy, who was touring a lot of artists on the Sparrow label and others. And there was other activity going on. They certainly weren't the only ones, but they were doing some significant tours, and also album releases as well. There were a number of independent Australian artists. We actually released the very, very first Hillsong album. It was a cassette-only release, I think in about 1989, 88, 89, somewhere there, called Spirit and Truth. And we did some live recordings with Youth Alive New South Wales and Victoria, and a number of other band recordings. And of course, Rebecca St. James, David and Helen's daughter, she actually recorded her very first album here in Australia before they went to America, because
She was 13, wasn't she?
she was 13, and under the name of Rebecca Jean. And that was a pretty brave move, I thought, that it would indicated, here's some parents who saw potential in their daughter and invested in recording this album. It cost them quite a bit of money. And it was really so that they would have something to then try and go and get a record deal somewhere else, which took a long time, but it happened.
Yeah, that's great. What happened with your career path after that?
Well, like a lot of things, when you've got some external factor that forces you to change, it opens up other opportunity. And so for me, I fell pretty quickly into other just casual work to pay the bills. I think I was laying turf for a few weeks and things like that, working on a farm. And then I had a phone call from a friend who worked at a commercial radio station who I knew through David and Helen, good friends of theirs, a guy named John O'Donnell. Hi, John, if you're watching this, who called me one day. He was working at a commercial station in Newcastle and said, there's a job going here in advertising sales, and I know that you've always been interested in radio, and I see potential in you and happy to put in a good word if you're interested in applying, which he must have done because I got the job. And so, that started, it was in early 92, and I started in commercial radio, and that then led to a career over 10 years at various commercial stations, initially in sales, which was only for a fairly short time, then on air, midnight to dawn, and that's a whole interesting experience all in itself, and then in other day parts at other radio stations, and then as a music director and a program director. And I spent about 10 years in commercial radio. But at the end of that time, I was just feeling like there's really something more significant that I need to be doing with more meaning to it. And I was drawn toward Christian media. And that took me to New Zealand. My wife and I and kids went over there for about 3 years and worked with REMA in New Zealand, which is a fairly long-established and reasonably large organisation, overseeing their programming. They had 3 radio networks there, and I had a little bit to do with the TV network that we started while I was there. and then came to Vision, where I am today. That was 20 years ago, and for the first 10 years was in programming-related roles, and then about 10 years ago, the board invited me to consider becoming the CEO, which I said, sure, I'll have a crack at that. And 10 years later, here I am still here.
Fantastic. And yes, congratulations. That's excellent. I was going to ask as well as regarding Christian musicians who are wanting to break into the industry today. What would you give as far as any advice for them? You know, sometimes that faith journey, you think you really believe God's put you in, you know, the role that you're doing, and things sometimes don't work out. What happened with the Smallbones? You must be questioning what happened. So I know it's really tough, and for them to keep persisting, or there might be a time when, how do you know when it's time to quit or when it's not right? What advice would you give? No, that's a long question.
No, that's fine. I think I'd probably say seek out somebody who's been a practitioner in the space, you know, other artists who've walked the journey themselves, because I haven't done that. So I don't feel I'm very qualified to give an artist advice about how they should, you know, approach a career, because it's a very hard gig. That's my observation. It takes a lot of persistence and passion and talent. So I think the thing I would recommend to anybody who's wanting to pursue something in any creative industry, so whether it's music or on the radio or on television or writing or anything that's creative, is first of all, follow your passions. Secondly, understand that there is a standard that you actually need to step up to. So try and be objective about where you're at. A lot of people think that their stuff's really good, but the other people listening, watching, reading, they might not share that same opinion. So try and just be really realistic about where you're at. And then thirdly, figure out, what do I need to do to you know, increase my craft and to hone my skill? What other people do I need to be exposed to? Who's been there before me? And stay humble in the whole process. And one of the challenging things with creative people often is there is a bit of ego. You know, we tend to be have a great opinion of ourselves. Well, try and be humble. I think that's a great piece of advice for anybody anywhere. Be humble, keep your eyes toward God, and then take opportunities when they come. Don't be afraid. Step out and be led by God. So probably good advice for anybody.
Definitely be led by God, and expect a long journey. Really.
That's right.
Because it takes a long time. Everyone thinks there's overnight successes, but they really might take 10, 20 years sometimes.
That is so true. You know, I don't think there is such a thing as an overnight success. There are always contributing factors that led, even if somebody who has sort of risen quite quickly, there's a foundation that they've built on that has projected them to that space. I think one of the other things to be realistic about too is I've heard someone say many years ago something that's really stuck in my mind that kind of goes in line with how tough it can be, and that is in Christian music in particular, and you can apply this to other things too, but if you want to end up with a small fortune from Christian music, then start with a large fortune, because it's a great way to lose money.
That's good. That's so true. Very good. That's so true, but definitely a long journey, because even David Smallbone, when he went to America, it took them years to get a breakthrough.
It did.
So that's
and they had to be persistent.
Persistent, absolutely, and really in tune with God, because sometimes when you think, I'm sure David must have thought of quitting when, you know, this collapse happened in Australia, would have been quite devastating, but that persistence and surrounding yourself with strong Christian people, like obviously you had Helen, who was a great support. So do you have an unsung hero, Phil?
I've been thinking about that question. I'd say, I mean, certainly my mother would be up there. She was an amazing lady. Went to be with the Lord in the mid-90s, and I've got great memories of her. Memories of her sitting playing at the piano with this old pianola. You remember those? You put the paper roll in and pedal away. That was my playing. But she'd sit there and she'd play, you know, hymns like "Great Is Thy Faithfulness." She'd sing along to that, and she was a woman of faith. And it was a tough journey for her too, because my dad passed away in the early 80s. So, she was a single mum with 6 kids herself from that point on. But she had good people around her, and she had trust and faith in God. So I think she'd get my nomination.
Good old mum.
That's
yes.
it. Mum's great.
That's great. Thank you so much, Phil, for your time. I really appreciate it. And it was fantastic hearing your story.
Thanks, Jackie. Great to talk.